Good afternoon. It is my privilege to be here again with the group of Debbie's Dream Foundation. I think I've worked with Debbie in this program for many, many years. And I'm happy to say that we are improving in our research and the efforts that we're doing. You have heard Dr. Ilsen give some of the latest on some of the new drugs that are being utilized now. And I'm going to talk about some of the policies that go into cancer research. It is really very evident now that more and more individuals are being identified with various malignancies. It is also true that we've identified many disparities. You heard Dr. Nilsson say that some individuals respond to drugs, some do not. And we have identified individuals who might be at higher risk of not responding to medications or not being eligible for the studies. One group that I've worked with is related to young individuals developing cancers that we have, in general, thought to be more related to a more experienced population. I used to say elderly, but you know, as I grow up a little bit myself, I have changed my articulation of that. And instead of saying elderly, I tell my patients the more experienced are the growing up population and so forth. But what we find with gastrointestinal malignancies, including cancers of the stomach, that we are finding these cancers in more and more a younger population. So we're using some of the genomics to try and help us identify populations that might be at higher risk. We have found that, yes, the younger kids, younger individuals, present with more advanced disease at the time of diagnosis, because when a 20-year-old comes in with abdominal pain, most physicians do not think of cancer as being related to the cause of the abdominal pain or other symptoms. Certainly, my youngest gastrointestinal cancer patient was 15 years old at the time of diagnosis. So again, that's a disparate population because the population presents with more advanced disease. So I'm going to cover some of the research that is ongoing and some of the things that policy can help us determine an understanding of cancer research. So I'll talk about the 1971 National Cancer Act through Moonshot 2017, and I will finish with some of the things that we can all do. So the National Cancer Act of 1971 was established to focus on research in cancer. This is a photo of President Nixon at the time signing that bill. Well, why was that bill important? You've heard today about a lot of research in many areas. Well, that bill, the National Cancer Act of 1971, actually established the National Cancer Institute. So the National Cancer Institute has been the focus of research for cancer care since 1971. It established the National Cancer Advisory Board, or NCAB, that actually signs over to the president. Individuals of the NCAB are approved and commissioned by the President of the United States to advise the president on what should be the legislation that administration supports. Now, probably one of the most important areas was establishment of the National Cancer Program. And the National Cancer Program consists of our National Cancer Institute approved centers. There are 69 approved National Cancer Institute centers around the country, including the ones that you have heard from our speakers today. Before me, Dr. Ilsen at Memorial Sloan Kettering, for my institution, the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Jefferson, and many other academic institutions and research institutes around the country. That supports our cancer research. Debbie's Dream Foundation has approved funding for many researchers around the country. Every single researcher that we have approved through Debbie's Dream Foundation, guess what? They are studying at the National Cancer Institute designated centers. So establishing research in this country was all a product of the National Cancer Act of 1971. Then President Nixon was very, very interested in furthering the research on cancer care. Since that time, we have patients either living with the disease and doing well, or patients surviving the disease. Now, that at that time in the early 70s, I was in medical school at the time, and routinely patients with advanced disease succumb to that disease. So lots of changes since that time. And this slide shows some of the trends in death rates among individuals. Note that for individuals who had lung cancer, the red slide, the red mark, note the tremendous drop. Note for gastric cancer, stomach cancer, it's the yellow line. There has been a tremendous drop in the number of individuals dying from stomach cancer in this country. And of all of the cancers, it has the greatest drop. So we've made tremendous strides. The same holds true for individuals with other cancers, and they're women. Note again, lung cancer decreasing in women, colorectal cancer, and two, in the yellow line, the significant drop in the death rate from gastric cancer or stomach cancer in women in this country. Well, I've mentioned disparate populations, disparate younger patients with gastric cancers or colorectal cancers. We are seeing a tremendous increase in this young population. Consequently, it has been designated a disparate population because of the younger individuals. More is known about colorectal cancer since there are so many more cases, but for young individuals, younger than 40 years old, there has been a 2% per year increase in colorectal cancer incidence in younger patients younger than 40. And obviously, for these individuals, they've not gone through colorectal screening as is recommended at 50 years, and therefore a tremendous disparate community because of the young individuals. African Americans with colorectal cancer. There is a 20% higher incidence in African Americans with colorectal cancer and a 40% higher death rate. For gastric cancer, again, a much higher incidence in African Americans, a much more aggressive tumor that tends to spread very quickly with very little response to the various agents that you have heard about. So a lot of our research is designated toward disparate communities, young individuals with colon cancer, are risk based on race and ethnicity. So a lot is going on. And one of the researchers in the area, Dr. Harold Freeman, said that There are lots of things that contribute to disparities in cancer, possibly the genomic or the on the gene environment by the culture, by the environment, and a lot of research undergoing that is on way now. And what we have to do in order to address these are to look at the whole spectrum of cancer care: prevention, early detection. How can we detect the cancers earlier? Because all of us know that earlier your cancer is diagnosed, the better are the treatment outcomes. We also have to look at treatments. Some individuals with cancer respond to treatment or to a treatment, and others do not. So finding those risks are the genomics of the tumor that might allow us to better predict who will respond, what therapy should be utilized. Do the younger patients or the disparate communities require a different treatment? We don't know that yet. So a lot of research ongoing to help us better define the risk of responding to treatment or the risk of not responding, and which treatments might be better for individuals in various categories. Because we know that gastric cancer is not a one shoe, and treatment cannot be one shoe fits all. So we've got to define what is the best treatment at any given time for a specific patient. So moving on to 2016. In his State of the Union address, January of 2016, President Obama said that now is the time for us to focus on cancer again. And his challenge to the researchers and clinicians treating patients with cancer was that he wanted to take what we planned to do in 10 years, finish it in 5. And he called it the cancer moonshot. So we're going to do in 5 years what you were expecting to do in 10. And he says, I'm putting Joe in charge of mission control. So Vice President Biden, therefore, in charge of the program, but it was President Obama who said he wanted the cancer moonshot. So as a result of the Cancer Moonshot program, the National Cancer Institute has established a number of programs. First of all is the Genomic Data Commons. Now, why do we need genetic data commons or genomic data commons? What we find is that I'm at my institution, I have one computer program. Another institution just across Philadelphia, a few blocks away, they have one. Those computers can't talk to each other, so we can't share information. Consequently, setting up a data commons where our computers can all speak the same language and therefore understand each other, combine data so that if there's one program or one clinical research trial at one institution, there could be 10 other institutions with similar information. Instead of hand-putting that data into the computers at each institution, and still they can't talk with each other, the Genomic Data Commons is putting together all of this information so that there can be increased data sharing and therefore easier interpretation of data. We're also developing and have developed now the National Cancer Institute as a drug formulary. And with the formulary, what we have, various companies have drugs. The National Cancer Institute has a few, but no way, again, of sharing information and working together. So the pharmaceutical companies are working with the National Cancer Institute to have one virtual drug formulary that is already intact and is operational. So within a year, we have that operational. And I'm actually one of the principal investigators on one of those trials, where we have received 24 different drugs from pharmaceutical companies, and we have put them all into one clinical trial. It's called the MATCH trial. We test the patient's tumor and then figure out which of our 24 drugs might be the best match for that patient's tumor for treatment. So, Moonshot, how does it work? Well, it is operated, or it was last year, from the Vice President's office at the White House. The Vice President brought together all of the federal agencies. So this was the first time that many of these agencies had ever sat with each other to define operational aspects of cancer care. So we had everything from the Energy Commission, the Veterans Administration, all of the military branches, and every federal agency to work with the National Cancer Institute in terms of processes. The National Cancer Institute, through the NIH, National Institutes of Health, that is the manager of the programs. Everything must be referred to the NCAB that I mentioned before, and the NCAB is the receptacle for all of the information going in for the president to respond to. I had the privilege of being a member of this Blue Ribbon panel. 28 individuals from around the country were selected to provide information to the vice president regarding the recommendations. So the overall goals of the Cancer Moonshot are to basically accelerate progress in cancer, including prevention and screening. And we determine the cutting edge research. What is important for every tumor type? What do we need to do? How can we share the data? How can we share the clinical trials and accomplish the clinical trials earlier? The FDA is a part of the group. So it's usually for drug development. When a drug is being developed by a company, they will develop the drug, do lots of clinical trials, and then present it to the FDA in terms of seeking approval. If the FDA has other requirements, the company has to go back and get those requirements done. But now we have FDA at the table early, so that any FDA requirements are entered into the program very early, and therefore, again, sharing of data, making sure that everybody is sitting at the table at the same time, and therefore accomplishing the outcomes of research much earlier. And enhanced data sharing is really the important thing. Usually for companies presenting something to the FDA has no access to the data until it's actually presented. But if they're at the table developing the clinical trials and requirements, we get all of that into the program early, and therefore one way of accomplishing our outcomes. The Cancer Moonshot right now, why? Well, we felt that this was the best time, and the president at that time, President Barack Obama, thought that this was feasible, it could be done, and with all of the technology that we have, now was the time. Not only that, immunotherapy has come of age, and it's another big research program. So rather than having all of these separate programs, they are brought together and information is shared. These are our goals. We were to develop recommendations, and we did develop 10 recommendations that were provided to the NCAB. The full report is on cancer.gov if you're interested. These were the members, and I was very fortunate to be a member of the group. The group continues to work now. I will not elaborate or articulate all 10 of the recommendations, but basically for all cancers, those important findings that have been accomplished in research and goals were brought into the recommendations. Disparities, so there is a large amount of research in each cancer type for which disparities have been found and designated. So for younger patients with gastric cancer, colorectal cancer, and others, there are specific research programs trying to define those individuals at greatest risk of developing the cancers, what can be done regarding prevention, and then a focus on early detection treatment, and for survivorship. So great recommendations, and those are ongoing at this time. These are just a summary of the recommendations. Note that we used letters instead of numbers. Although there are 10, we didn't want to give the impression that something was number one. All of these are number one and will ongo simultaneously. We also wanted to make sure that for individuals that there is increased utilization of good medical standard of care, such that that information is readily available. It's also apparent, as I mentioned, that some individuals are at higher risk of developing cancer. We don't know why young individuals are developing gastric and colon cancers at a higher rate now than we have seen in the traditional population. Some people call it the elderly population. I just say those that are grown up and continuing to grow. So hopefully these measures will allow all of us to continue to grow up. And it is so important that after the presidential recommendation and putting Vice President Joe Biden in charge, January of 2016, the first meeting of our group, the Blue Ribbon Panel, occurred in April, and we literally had to work. But in September, we submitted our recommendations to the National Cancer Advisory Board. In October, the NCAB approved our recommendations. It went back to the White House, and on December 14th, 2016, less than a year from President Obama's decree, this was passed through the Congress with bipartisan support. It literally sailed through the various committees in both the House and the Senate. The Congress approved it December 14th, and I believe it was December 21st, but before President Obama went on his Christmas vacation, the 21st Century Cures Act was signed and was the law. It is the law at this time. So it was approved $1.8 billion over 7 years, and 7 years to allow us to collect all the data, process all the data, and so forth. And with $300 million, although the 2017 budget had already been passed, this was placed into the 2017 budget, so we're working with those funds now. And the funding was matched to our Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations. So the funding, the program was later named Beau Biden Cancer Moonshot for the 21st Century Cures Act. This is the funding that was given through the program, and it was anticipated that this would work with other funding from the National Cancer Institute and other initiatives, and this was what was anticipated over this period to 2023, with additional funding from other sources anticipated. Now, one thing that I think all of us can do here today, you may have heard that President Trump's recommendation for his budget was to cut the NIH and NCI funding by more than 20%. So although the Cancer Moonshot is the law now, if there is a subsequent decrease in other funding for NIH and the NCI, that is going to significantly negatively impact our research efforts, all the responses and all of the strides that have been made since 1971, this is likely to decrease our funding significantly, our funding to the institutions, our funding to researchers. Yes, we have granted from DDF funding to investigators, but the amount of money that we give them from this organization is not enough to totally fund that person with everything they need throughout the year. So if there is not NCI funding to institutions, that's going to negatively not only impact research, but these are our patients, our community lives. These are people that we're negatively impacting, and I think it's very important. My congressional representative knows what I think. And if we keep bombarding their offices with letters, with phone calls, letting them know how you think about the recommendation to decrease NCI funding, I think is very important, and that's something that we can all do. Find out the telephone numbers and addresses of your congressional representatives. You can send them to your 2 senators, plus your individual representative in the Congress. So find out these people and let them know what you, as a patient advocate, as a family member of someone with cancer, and to our continued growth, and let them know what your thoughts are. I think that's so important. So for each of the 10 recommendations that the Blue Ribbon panel developed, each recommendation has been given an implementation team from the NCI, and therefore each recommendation has a plan, and that plan will continue. We're bringing in additional people from the cancer institutes, all of the cancer centers, to have additional people. So there is an implementation team, an implementation plan for each of the 10 recommendations. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I think research is ongoing. There are plans to bring more people into the umbrella of cancer research, and more importantly, to make sure that there are data sharing among the various teams. And with all of that, one of the other things that is included in the overall plan is to make access to the clinical trials easier for patients to access and for their community physicians to access. So again, there is data sharing such that it is making information effective for all users, making sure that information reaches the clinicians and the patients in communities so that there is early benefit to patients for the clinical trials, for the community physicians understanding and being able to implement both the standard of care as well as research. And with that, we expect to advance clinical trials, clinical research, basic research, and also that we can accomplish President Obama's vision that yes, we can do in 5 years what we had planned to do in 10, and therefore, if we continue planning and continue implementation of this treatment idea and this infrastructure process, that we will someday cure and prevent cancer. So thank you so much.